I remember the day as if it were ordinary, a Thursday with a slow train and a cup of coffee gone cold. It was one of those small, ordinary mornings when nothing in the world seemed poised for change. I had been living with him for 3 years, and our life had settled into a comfortable silence. Our apartment was small and full of quiet habits that felt like the glue of a long relationship. The phone itself was old and unreliable, the battery barely holding a day. It had a cracked screen protector and a case worn thin at the corners. By most measures, it looked like junk, but to me, the phone held small monuments of my life. There were voice notes and photos, drafts of messages, little things that mattered more than their size. The device refused to charge sometimes, but it carried the sounds of nights and the traces of ordinary days. I had kept the phone because it contained memories I had not wanted to upload into clouds and scatter. He was kind in quiet ways, learning how I liked my tea and remembering small details. Over time, he began making decisions for both of us without asking. He would rearrange the furniture and give away things he decided we did not need. His helpfulness slowly took on the shape of decisions that excluded me. He would say he was trying to be practical when I felt erased. Those small intrusions accumulated until they changed the rhythm of our life. One morning, I found a message that made my hands go cold without drama. Sold phone, $80, okay? The text was casual, like a grocery list, and it landed on my chest with the weight of betrayal. He described the phone as broken and arranged a pickup with someone in our neighborhood. There was no apology, no asking, just the matter-of-fact trade of something that belonged to me. I called the buyer and found confirmation of the sale in a string of messages between them. The transaction appeared tidy and final. I did not shout or make a scene. I felt a quiet, stunned emptiness that made my hands go numb. I told myself I was overreacting and that I could reconstruct what I had lost. I checked backups in cloud accounts and found partial restorations and gaps where memories should be. The voice note from my sister was not entirely backed up. The videos stored in a folder I had never synced were inaccessible, and some drafts of letters were gone. I chose not to rage on social media. Instead, I watched and measured my response. Anger was a dull thing at first. Then it sharpened into something practical. My revenge would not be loud. I wanted it to be steady and true to who I was. I mapped practical steps to recover what had been taken and to teach him that some things were not his to decide. I asked a friend for a lead and tracked the buyer to a small repair shop on a side street. The thought of confronting him in public felt cheap and performative. What I wanted was not spectacle, but restitution, and perhaps the more private lesson of being taken seriously. The repairman brought the phone out wrapped in a rag, scuffed and more broken than I imagined. He was polite and surprised when I asked if it was still there. It took patient attempts to wake the device and coax files into view, but many of the voice notes and photos survived. When I listened to my sister's late-night voice note, I felt a quiet relief that did not need to be loud. I sat on the edge of my bed and cried from simple human relief rather than melodrama. Recovery had cost time and money and a small, stingy pride. I set the phone gently on the kitchen table and told him I had retrieved it. I described the errands, the calls, the small fees, and the time I had spent getting it back. I did not wave it like a trophy. I explained calmly how his decision had forced me to act. He apologized in a way that felt practiced, and I asked for real change instead of words. He said he understood, and that he would do better. His tone was soft and immediate, the kind of apology that hopes to close the wound without addressing the cause. I began to create small distances, refusing invitations when I needed space. I reclaimed mornings with runs and new coffee shops, signing up for a pottery class I had wanted. I was not trying to punish him theatrically, but to rebuild a life that reflected my values. My boundaries were clear and quiet. Ask me before you decide my things are disposable. The revenge I chose was practical and domestic. I wanted to rearrange my life around the principle that my private things were not for others to trade. He started to ask before moving things and left notes asking if it was okay to give things away. His small acts were a patient watch of real change rather than performative gestures. We had arguments, but they were rooted in repair rather than contempt. Months later, the remediation felt less like a fixed point and more like a slow, honest reorientation. I watched whether his apologies were followed by the labor of habit, not just the speech of contrition. I think back to small details. The pattern of his laugh, the way he folded his shirts, how he left the toothpaste cap open. Sometimes the mind latches onto little things as proof of a love that was once steady. There were evenings when we cooked together and the kitchen felt like a tiny shared world. Other nights we sat silent with separate screens, the quiet between us widening like a slow tide. I began to notice choices I had accepted as normal were actually small incursions into my life. He would decide what to keep and what to discard, without thinking to ask me. It is surprising how small acts accumulate into a pattern that changes the contour of a relationship. When the phone was gone, so was a particular kind of feeling. The ease of knowing my past was safe. That missing ease taught me to be precise about what I would protect. I found satisfaction in small practicalities, labeling the drawers, backing up files, writing dates on boxes. I learned to name my needs plainly, instead of hoping they would be understood without words. Revenge in my life became the steady exercise of care for myself rather than dramatic retribution. I took delight in small, ordinary acts that belonged to me. Choosing a new mug, planting a new herb. I discovered that living on purpose was its own kind of resistance. His apologies came and went, sometimes earnest, sometimes thin. I watched whether his words were followed by the consistent labor of change. Change shows itself in small habits repeated until they become the default. It was not a single grand gesture that told me he might be different, but the steady turning of his attention. I began to keep a little ledger of incidents, not as evidence for a trial, but as a map of choices. The ledger helped me see patterns instead of being overwhelmed by single acts. I found friends to talk to who held my experience without trying to fix it. Their distance and perspective helped me understand that boundaries are not walls, but guides. I started to write again in a small notebook, jotting thoughts that had been too soft to voice aloud. Writing sharpened my sense of what I was angry about versus what I was grieving. Grief and anger are not the same thing. One is loss. The other is the body's way of demanding change. I gave myself permission to grieve the version of the relationship that had once felt safe. That permission eased something inside me and made it possible to act without rage. Instead of attempting to punish him, I chose to protect myself and my memories. I insisted on being consulted about the things that mattered to me. The phone incident became a lesson that I taught gently through actions rather than proclamation. Every time he asked before giving something away, I felt a small victory, like a bridge slowly rebuilt. Sometimes his questions were awkward. Sometimes his curiosity felt performative. Over time, the awkwardness smoothed into a kind of steady attention I had not expected. I was careful not to conflate improvement with perfection, and I allowed room for error. We had conversations about respect and about what it meant to include another person in decisions. Those conversations were not always neat, but they were real, and they mattered. There were moments when I wondered if staying was a sign of weakness or of understanding. I decided staying could be a conscious choice rather than a passive acceptance. Choosing to remain required both courage and clarity. It required me to know where my boundaries began and ended. When he asked me to explain why the phone mattered, I told him plainly, it held my history. I explained that some things are not replaceable because their value is not monetary. He listened then, perhaps differently than before. Listening is an underrated skill, and its practice can change small habits into deeper respect. At times I caught myself softening too quickly, and I would step back and reassert what I needed. Balance between forgiveness and self-protection is delicate and personal. I rebuilt small rituals that fed me, a walk at dusk, a call with a friend on Sunday afternoons, a handwritten note left for myself. These actions were not meant as punishments but as anchors. I was quietly verifying what I wanted my life to revolve around. His mistakes taught me to be exact with my words and to stop assuming goodwill without evidence. Some of the language we used with each other shifted to include permission and questions. He began to say, "Is this okay with you?" more often, and I noticed the lift in my chest that came with being asked. It was not an immediate fix, but it was a start. Time does not solve everything, but it reveals what has truly changed. I stopped measuring our love by grand gestures and started measuring it by daily integrity. The day-to-day choices matter more than the dramatic scenes in the long run. I allowed myself small acts of independence and noticed how they steadied me. I kept the phone charged in a corner and used it as a touchstone for what I'd reclaimed. Sometimes a simple object can symbolize the larger work of putting pieces back in place. I realized I deserved to have my little rituals honored. The revenge of the quiet kind had a way of making me more compassionate to myself. It allowed me to be kinder to my own mistakes while being clear about what I would not accept. In the quiet moments, I felt gratitude for the clarity the situation had given me. Clarity can come from pain, and sometimes the price for it is learning to be unabashedly oneself. I continued to stitch small boundaries into everyday life. I kept a separate charging cable and a small labeled pouch for the things that mattered most. The simple act of labeling felt like a ceremony of respect. Each labeled item reminded me that I was naming my life back into being. He learned to pause before acting in the shared spaces of our home. He would stand at the shelf and look, asking whether a book was mine or ours. Those questions were like little bowstrings tightening and loosening with time. They were the sound of a relationship shifting. I began to notice when he left the room because he respected my space, not to avoid a conversation. I found myself willing to repair and to build if the repairs were real. Once, when we argued about something trivial, he said aloud that he had been selfish in small ways and wanted to try to do better. The admission was plain and quiet. I answered that I believed him, but that belief would need to be measured by consistency. He nodded and proposed we set small agreements for the things we both valued. I liked the humility of that idea. It felt practical and humane. Friends asked why I had not made his betrayal public, why I had not taken dramatic steps. I explained that humiliation is not the same as change, and that my aim was to reconfigure my life so that my voice mattered. Making a scene could have won applause for a moment, but would not necessarily keep my things safe. The quiet method required patience, and I had learned patience the hard way. There were days when I resented how long the work took. I resented the slow tilt of habits toward fairness, and the small failures on both our parts. I resented that what I wanted was so often phrased as an imposition. But then I would notice a gentle act. He had remembered the pattern of my favorite tea. He had left a note before clearing a drawer. And those moments felt like stitches that held a seam together. The soft revenge had an unexpected side effect. It made me more honest with myself. I stopped excusing things I had once accepted and started naming what I wanted without apology. When I said no, the no was not sharp but steady. Saying no allowed me to say yes to other things. More time with friends, more projects that did not involve proving my worth. It felt like turning toward a life that included me. Sometimes I imagined the scene I had not staged. Him confronted before neighbors, embarrassed and contrite in public. The image felt satisfying for a moment, then thin. It did not compare to the steadier satisfaction of organizing my life so that my small, private monuments were honored. I chose to recover what was mine, and then to live in a way that would make future recoveries less likely to be necessary. My revenge, if it could be called that, was also a lesson in generosity. I learned to extend grace when mistakes were followed by work, and to withdraw it when patterns persisted. I did not want to build a life of perpetual vigilance, but I also would not let casual disregard become a pattern I accepted. That tension kept me honest about what I wanted to keep in my life. Months later, the phone incident became a quiet reference in our house. It was not a scar that ached daily, but a seam that taught us how to stitch. We spoke about it sometimes, not in accusation, but in the way people discuss a lesson learned. He would say that he had been thoughtless, and that he understood why I had acted the way I did. I would answer that his work to change had to be steady and patient. One afternoon, I found myself laughing at a private joke with him, and then noticing how easy it felt to pause and name a small boundary. That combination of warmth and clarity was new. We were not rewritten versions of our past selves, but we were learning how to be companionable in ways that included consent. The work of being attentive to each other was ongoing and imperfect, but it was visible. I kept a selection of photos printed and stacked in a drawer. They were the images I chose to keep physically. My sister's smile, my mother's hands making coffee, a winter landscape from a trip I took alone. Those things were not unimportant because they were small. They were important because they were mine. I began to treat the small things with ceremony. There was no pomp, only a quiet acknowledgement. Once he asked about a picture I had taken years before, and I told him the story behind it. He listened with an attention that felt new. There was no grand apology in that moment, only a willingness to hear. It was not enough to erase the past, but it was enough to make me see that the person beside me had shifted, at least a little. Change rarely arrives in a flash. It arrives in small increments that accumulate into different choices. I continued to keep the phone charged and to back up files in multiple places. It felt less like guarding against betrayal and more like respecting my life. The work of protection became an act of self-respect. When he saw me taking precautions, he began to mirror them in his own habits. He bought a small pouch for his cables and started labeling things we tended to confuse. These were small signs, but they mattered. Sometimes I worried that I had softened too much, that my patience could be mistaken for accommodation. Then I would recall the moment I had set the phone on the table and told him calmly what he had done. That memory anchored me. I had reclaimed not only my devices but a voice that had been quieted by routine. Our fights changed. They became more about negotiation and less about blame. We discussed expectations and the daily logistics of living together. The conversations were not always easy, but they were gentler in tone. The lines we drew were not rigid. They were invitations to check in. I found that being explicit about boundaries made everyday life less fraught. I made room for my own projects. I joined a small writing group and began to submit short pieces to a local magazine. The act of creating was its own revenge, a reclamation of time and attention he had once assumed he could repurpose. My writing became a place where I could translate the small particulars of anger and relief into sentences that felt true. There were moments of doubt when I wondered whether this was the right path. I sought counsel from friends who had been through similar betrayals, and their stories varied. Some had left quickly and cleanly. Others had found reasons to stay. No single answer fit me. The decision to continue our relationship was mine, shaped by a mixture of affection, practicality, and a conviction that people can change if they are willing to do the work. He did not change overnight. Sometimes he faltered and slipped back into old patterns. I addressed those slips with the steady insistence I had learned to use. When he apologized and then acted the same way, the apology lost meaning. When he apologized and followed it with consistent behavior, the apology grew into trust. That difference was crucial and practical. Slowly, the edges of my anger softened. The warmth of the good parts of our life arrived more frequently than before. We ate dinners with less tension and sometimes with real laughter. Those ordinary evenings felt like small restorations. The intimacy we rebuilt was quieter, less reckless, and more respectful. I did not forget what had happened, but I was willing to see the possibility of repair. The soft revenge had transformed into a mature pattern of living with boundaries and returning to kindness where it was deserved. I loved the parts of him that had always been gentle, and decided that I would not let those parts be overshadowed by his thoughtlessness. Loving someone does not mean tolerating patterns that injure you. It means asking for the work you need to stay whole. Sometimes I still thought about the little ledger I had kept. I no longer needed it in the same way, but it taught me something about keeping track of my own life. Memory, like a ledger, can be an instrument of clarity rather than a weapon. I used it to remind myself of steps forward rather than to build a case. One quiet evening, I sat with the phone in my hand and watched a video of my mother dancing. It was grainy but bright, a simple family moment. I felt a tenderness so clear it surprised me. Protecting that tenderness had been the point all along. The modest revenge I had chosen allowed me to live without performing hurt for an audience. When friends asked why I had not struck back in a dramatic way, I told them the truth. I wanted to remain myself. I did not want to become a spectacle to prove a point. I wanted to be the person who moved forward with dignity and deliberate attention. That felt like more than revenge. It felt like growth. In the end, the relationship that survived was not the same one we had started with. It was steadier and required work from both of us. He continued to be imperfect, and I did too. We had new arguments about small things like grocery lists and who forgot to replace the light bulb, but those arguments were less about erosion and more about tending. We had chosen to do the tending together, or to let the house drift. The phone remained a small, ordinary object that anchored a larger lesson. It reminded me that private things matter, and that decisions about them have to be shared. I had learned to name my needs and to expect that naming to be respected. The quiet revenge had been to live in a way that no longer allowed small erasures to define me. There was a softness to the way I claimed myself after that. I was no less kind, but I was firmer about my limits. I found joy in the ordinary again, in small Sunday walks and quiet dinners. The ordinary had become the measure of safety. I learned that the safest place is often the one you defend with a gentle insistence rather than a dramatic show. If there is a final scene to share, it is this. The two of us making dinner with the phone charging nearby and my notebook open on the counter. He points to a photograph and asks me the story behind it. I tell him, and he listens with an attention that feels earned. The lesson of the phone remains in the background like a lesson learned in the grammar of small things. The revenge that was soft had been a quiet insistence on my own dignity and history. It asked for nothing flashy, only for the steady return of respect. In that way, it was not only about him, but about me. It was about becoming someone who could set limits, and also be present for the ordinary pleasures of a shared life. It was about making sure my small, private things were honored. I think of that Thursday sometimes, not with heat, but with a clear memory of how a life shifts in small increments. The clock of a relationship is not wound by single events, but by the accumulation of little choices. I had chosen, quietly and deliberately, to make my choices count. The softness of the revenge had the surprising edge of strength. This is not a story of triumph in the way a headline might demand. There was no dramatic separation, no public spectacle. Instead, there was a patient series of decisions. To recover what was lost, to insist on being consulted, to build boundaries without bitterness. I discovered that standing up for myself calmly could change the shape of my days. In the end, the phone was just a phone, but it stood for something larger. It stood for the right to keep what is private, and for the need to be asked before someone else decides your things have no value. That small principle reshaped our home. It taught him to pause and ask. It taught me to say yes or no without apology. I sleep easier now. The little rituals I set in motion keep my days steady. The revenge I enacted was gentle and steady and felt true to who I am. It taught me that the most lasting corrections are those that change how you live, not how loud you are while doing it. The quiet life we continue to share is not perfect, but it is honest, and that honesty is the real lesson the phone taught me.